Here, drink.
Oh, thank you.
Slow down, there's plenty.
He found her collapsed in the scorching desert and gave her his last drop of water. He didn't want a reward just to see her live. But 3 days later, the sound of phantom hooves shook his porch. Standing in the moonlight was a horse that shouldn't exist, bringing a gift he'd never forget. The heat in the Arizona high desert doesn't just sit on you, it pushes against you. Elias stood on his porch, wiping a layer of gritty dust from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. The wind had been howling for 3 days straight, kicking up a wall of orange sand that made it hard to tell where the ground ended and the sky began. He was about to head inside to escape the glare when he saw something odd near the dry creek bed at the edge of his land. It looked like a pile of discarded clothes at first, but then it moved. Just a small, weak flicker of a hand reaching upward. Elias didn't think twice. He grabbed a canteen from the hook by the door and started jogging, his boots sinking into the soft, hot sand. As he got closer, his heart sank. It was a woman, dressed in traditional Apache clothing that was torn and caked in white alkali dust. Her skin was a frightening shade of pale, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from the sun. "Easy now," Elias muttered, though he wasn't sure if she could even hear him. He knelt down in the dirt, ignoring the way the heat scorched his knees. He slid one arm behind her neck, lifting her head just enough to press the canteen to her mouth. She didn't grab for it like he expected. She was too far gone for that. He had to trickle the water in slowly, drop by drop, watching her throat work as she swallowed. Her eyes fluttered open for a second. They were dark and glazed with fever, looking right through him as if he were a ghost. She whispered something in a language he didn't know, her voice sounding like sandpaper on wood. Elias didn't ask her name or how she ended up 5 miles from the nearest road. He just scooped her up. She was dangerously light, like a bird made of bone and spirit. He carried her back toward the shade of his cabin, the desert silent around them, knowing that if he had waited even 10 more minutes, the sun would have finished what it started. Najoni spent the next 2 days wrapped in a heavy wool blanket on Silas's porch, watching the horizon with eyes that seemed to see things he couldn't. Silas didn't pester her with questions. He just brought her bowls of warm broth and kept the water pitcher full. He noticed the way she looked at his old farm horse, a gray gelding named Barnaby who spent most of his time limping around the small corral. She didn't say anything, but she walked over once and placed a hand on the horse's scarred flank, whispering something that made the old animal stand perfectly still for the first time in years. By the 3rd morning, the fever had broken completely. Silas was out back chopping wood when he heard the low rumble of an engine and the soft jingle of tack. A battered green truck pulled up the drive, and 2 men stepped out. They were dressed in worn denim and Stetson hats, their faces lined by the same sun that had nearly taken the woman's life. They didn't look like they were looking for trouble, just their kin. Najoni stood up from the porch chair, her strength returning in a way that surprised Silas. She walked toward the truck without looking back, but at the last second, she stopped. She turned and looked at Silas, her dark eyes locking onto his with a strange intensity. "The desert has a long memory, Silas," she said, her voice finally clear and steady. "It knows who gives and who takes. You gave when the well was dry." She reached out and touched the wooden support beam of the porch, leaving a small smudge of red earth from her palm. "Watch the moon 2 nights from now. A debt of the heart is never left unpaid." Before Silas could ask what she meant, she climbed into the truck. He stood there with the axe still in his hand, watching the dust from their tires settle back into the heat. The ranch felt emptier than it ever had before, and as the sun began to dip, he found himself staring at that red handprint on his porch, wondering if the heat had finally started playing tricks on his mind. The silence of the high desert usually feels like a heavy blanket, but on the 2nd night after Najoni left, it felt more like a held breath. Silas sat on his porch, the wood still warm from the day's sun, watching the moon rise over the jagged peaks of the mountains. He kept thinking about that red handprint she'd left on the post. He wasn't a superstitious man, but the air felt charged, like the static before a lightning strike. Around midnight, it started. It wasn't a thunder from the sky, but a vibration coming through the soles of his boots. It was a rhythmic, pounding beat that grew louder with every second. Silas stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the old lantern hanging by the door. In the silver-blue light of the full moon, a cloud of white dust exploded from the ridge line. Out of the haze emerged a shape that made Silas's breath hitch in his chest. It was a horse, but not like any animal he had seen in 60 years of ranching. It was a massive stallion, its coat so white it looked like it was woven from the moonlight itself. The horse didn't slow down as it hit the flat ground of the yard. It moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, its hooves striking the earth with the sound of a hammer on an anvil. Silas stepped back against the house, the lantern trembling in his grip. The stallion skidded to a halt just 10 feet from the porch, tossing its head and letting out a scream that echoed off the canyon walls for miles. As the dust settled, Silas saw the details. The horse had no saddle or bridle, but its mane was intricately braided with eagle feathers and strips of buckskin. Hanging from a cord around its thick neck was a small, turquoise medicine bag, the exact same one Najoni had worn when he found her in the dirt. The stallion stood perfectly still, its chest heaving, steam rising from its muscles in the cool night air. Its eyes weren't wild with fear, they were focused on Silas with a piercing, ancient intelligence. It was a ghost of the old world, a creature of legend standing in his front yard. Silas realized then that this wasn't just a gift. It was a living, breathing debt of honor, a spirit of the desert sent to stand guard over the man who had shared his water when it mattered most. The white stallion didn't come to Silas to be tamed. For the first few days, the horse stayed at the far edge of the pasture, a pale ghost haunting the fence line. Every time Silas approached with a halter or even a bucket of grain, the animal would vanish into the brush with a defiant toss of its head. It wasn't fear in the horse's eyes, it was a demand for respect. Silas stopped trying to catch him. Instead, he sat on the top rail of the corral and just existed in the same space. He talked to the air about the weather and the chores, letting his voice become a part of the desert's natural hum. On the 4th afternoon, the heat was particularly brutal. Silas was kneeling by a broken water pipe, struggling to tighten a valve with slick, sweaty hands. He felt a shadow fall over him. He didn't move, holding his breath as he heard the heavy, rhythmic puff of air against the back of his neck. The stallion was standing right behind him. Slowly, the horse lowered its massive head, nudging Silas's shoulder with a velvet muzzle. It wasn't a surrender. It was a partnership. From that moment on, the ghost horse followed Silas like a shadow, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The peace of the ranch was shattered on Thursday by the roar of a heavy diesel engine. A black dually truck, polished to a mirror shine, tore up the dirt driveway and skidded to a stop, kicking a plume of grit onto Silas's porch. A man named Garrett stepped out. He was a local cattle baron who owned half the county and acted like he owned the other half. He didn't look at Silas. His eyes were locked on the white stallion standing like a statue in the paddock. "I've heard the stories, Silas," Garrett said, his voice like gravel in a blender. "A spirit horse showing up out of nowhere? That animal matches the description of a high-value stud reported stolen from a private transport 3 weeks ago. I've got the paperwork right here to recover it for the state." Garrett slapped a folded manila envelope against his thigh. He had 2 hired hands with him, both carrying heavy lariats and looking like they were itching for a fight. "He wasn't stolen," Silas said, stepping between the men and the gate. "He was a gift." Garrett laughed, a cold, dry sound. "A gift from who?" "The wind." "Stand aside, old man. By sunset, that horse is going in my trailer, or I'm calling the sheriff to haul you to jail for felony theft." Just as Garrett stepped toward the gate, the horizon shifted. A dozen riders appeared on the ridge, sitting silent on their horses like statues against the burning sky. Najoni was at the front. She didn't say a word, but the tribal police emblems on the trucks behind her spoke plenty. Garrett's paperwork suddenly looked like the lie it was. He backed off, his boots scuffing the dirt as he retreated to his truck, realizing some debts are too old and too deep for a man like him to touch. Now, the white stallion is a local legend. He's never been saddled, and he's never been fenced in. He simply stays. Travelers say if you pass the ranch at midnight, you'll see a flash of moonlight running beside an old man on a porch. Silas isn't just a hermit anymore. He's the keeper of a ghost, a reminder that the desert never forgets a drop of water given in kindness.